Wes, we're talking about a question item here. And he asked me, he goes, what kind of questions should we ask? And I said, I was a little more direct. I said, do you know that your micro packages are working, or do you think that? Part of it is we want to break it down. And of course, I think the question comes up, I can figure out how to operate. That is question here. Wes softened it by saying, do we get a positive return on the investment? And I'm going to say most people think they do, most people don't know it. It don't really depend upon the environment of the field and so forth. And we wanted to tear it down, kind of look at different packages and a couple of examples, and go ahead and say what exactly we're doing. I don't know, it's a pretty good output, I would say.
Okay, so to go over the presentation outline, so what we're going to be talking about to you today is we're going to basically go through the criteria that we need to make sure all these things are in line if we're going to apply these micro packs. So we're going to start with pH. We need to make sure that those are at optimal levels for nutrient uptake. Then we're going to get into corn and soybean nutrient removal for average yields. We'll talk about the characteristics of these nutrients. Are they immobile or mobile in the soil profile? Then we're going to break down a couple micronutrient packages. We're going to look at it in an agronomic way and an economic way. Then we'll take a look at uptake curves. It's pretty critical to time these correctly for optimal uptake and a return on investment and a bump in yield. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some sound agronomic approaches to dosing these micronutrients in our agronomic programs.
Countless times, we shoot for that 6.2 pH rate. Not that good. Right in 6.5. Variability there. But we know that if we keep a lot of our. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that the pH out there went with a 5.5, saying, I don't think it impacts that. Or if you're running out there, it's free line, get it from a water treatment plant, like it in the field, about a 7.2, 7.3. So we want to keep those micronutrients. The lower the pH, the more they become available, but then we get other restrictions for the macros and secondaries. If we go higher, we run into issues there. So we have a crop. Every crop has an ideal pH. Our row crops, 5. Give or take a few points.
So now, since we know where our pHs need to be, we need to understand this table, and we need to understand it pretty well. So what this is a nutrient removal and characteristic chart for 220 bushel corn. I felt that was a pretty fair average to use for our area. So I'm just going to walk you through this chart because we need to understand it. So the top 3 here, the N, P, and K, we're all very familiar with it. It's probably what we talk the most about. Those are our macros. So these, we already have programs built for them. The fertility program's built. It's soil applied. We know nitrogen is mobile. We're all probably using stabilizers with our nitrogen. Phosphorus, we know, is pretty stable in the soil. And potassium, that moves in soil solution. We move down the chart here, we get into our secondaries. We got sulfur and mag. Sulfur is kind of like potassium. It moves in soil solution. Again, these should be built out in our programs, just like our macros. So these should be set. We get down here at the bottom of this chart from calcium down to iron. Those are our micros. That's what we're going to focus on here next. And in corn, I want to talk about specifically zinc and boron. I think these should be incorporated more and more into our programs. If we put them in at the right time and at the right rate, we can get a response to them. So zinc, we know, is immobile. Boron, we know, is very mobile in the soil. And we need to realize and know all this stuff so we understand it, because for crop needs and for timing, this is critical. And you'll see that here as we start breaking these micros down. So the first product we're going to break down here is for corn. We're going to stay with corn here at the beginning of the presentation. So this is right off the label of this product. So this isn't me just pulling this stuff out of the clouds. This is right off the label. It's a liquid. It's a 005, so a potassium product with micronutrients. They're saying to apply it in furrow or foliar. They recommend applying it at planting with starter fertilizer, foliar at standard herbicide or early fungicide timing, or late fungicide timing, which is BT. They say it's designed to mimic a naturally occurring molecule for nutrient acquisition. And then they also say it increases production of amino acids, carbohydrates that fuel plant growth and reproduction. And it's like I say, it's important we focus here on the timing. I mean, this is pretty vague. Like I would not go out and, it's basically saying any time you can apply it. We'll narrow that down here in a little bit, but this is just the background, and this is what you'll see when you're looking at the label of any micro product. So this is the steps that we need to take when these products are proposed to us on the farm. We need to have some sort of methodology laid out just like this so we understand what we're really dealing with here. So first thing we need to look at is our product density. And for this product, it's 9.76 pounds a gallon. Then we need to look at the rate. They're saying it's a pint. I went ahead and made it 0.125 gallons an acre so we can do this math easier. So the next thing I did here is I took calculated the pounds of product per acre. We get this 1.2. And then this next block on the table, we're calculating the pounds of nutrient that are actually being applied per acre with this product at that 1 pint rate. So if we're taking that 5% and multiplying it by that pounds of product per acre figure. And if you walk across there for potassium, you're getting 0.060 pounds of nutrient applied per acre, sulfur 0.024, boron 0.0012, and so forth. So once you do that step, you need to stop and think a minute. Think back to that table that we discussed on removals for 220 bushel corn or whatever your yield goal may be. We need to ask ourselves, are we meeting those removals for 220 bushel corn? Well, in this case, the answer is no. So what we did here is we took that pounds of nutrient applied and we divided it by what that removal figure actually is. So for boron, it's 0.066. And you see there, we're getting 1.8% of the removal being satisfied. So you go across there for iron, which really is not that important in our soils. You get 0.8, manganese 6.8, and zinc 1.4%. So then everything has a cost tied to it. This product here costs $36 a gallon, and I broke it down to $4.50 an acre to use this micro pack.
Well, part of it also is not a lot of recommendations boron, or we really need it, what we need to have. I'm not saying that we need to go out and meet across the board by micronutrients, by removal rates, but when we know we have certain microbes that activity for the crop is relatively high, we have to get close. So in this particular package, short, it's been a $4.50 an acre. What exactly are we getting? So looking at this and what we did, same package, micro package. We're looking at when we got pretty accurate pricing on those different components. So 28 math, obviously there's no phosphorus in this. When we took potassium all the way through, found a product with sample on, totaled up what it had, you've got 4 cents worth of nutrient in that micro packaging. So we know that it costs $4.50 an acre to put it out there. Nutrient wise, we got the 24, so we're looking at $4.20 difference. Saying, okay, there was another in there, a product, and it was a biological they put in there. So we have to throw basically the entire cost of that biological has to be $4. Just keep a hold of that for a second.
Okay.
This is we've got a field here. It's got the soil test thing. There's quite a bit of variability in this particular field, and we look at the zinc uptake. We also know that corn is sensitive, highly sensitive to zinc levels. There's parts of that field that we're probably not getting a major payback on, but there's other areas that'll make it a little difference on that. A limiting factor. Doesn't move in the soil. We got to remember that. Put that zinc down in a band there. A quart of 9%. Pretty much equals that 200 bushel corn removal. And if we can put that down in our starter, I mean, just about everybody that I work with got zinc. But we can put it, run it down, and pretty much do an in-grow system. And that part's taken care of. I've always said that I like to do as many things to that plant as possible. Starter plant, there, I can make it work. But less time to cross the field. Nobody likes to see another piece of going across. So this is a good fit for zinc to add it into the starter.
So then if we look at another way to put on boron, if we remember that micropack was 1.8% boron. So a more agronomic approach is, we know boron is essential during the tasseling and silking stages of the corn crop. And if you look here, this is our boron uptake curve. So after about V8, it takes off, and it takes off fast. And in the bottom right here of this slide, we have basically soil test, or not soil test, tissue test, that basically from V3 up to the dent stage, we're at 6 to 9 parts per million boron in this tissue. So boron's deficient in the corn throughout the season. So go back to the timing that we were talking about earlier. We can place this boron, a liquid boron, in its side dress, but we have to remember that it's very mobile in the soil. So, and also a lot of us are starting to side dress a little bit earlier. I have guys that as soon as they can row the corn, they're out there side dressing. So we need to remember risk mitigation. Do you want to put that boron out there, and take a chance of it getting lost? So I think the most appropriate place for boron is in a V8 to VTR1 fungicide pass. And then you have to also remember, unlike macros, microbes, they're immobile in the corn plant. So we want that boron concentration at the ear leaf during that tasseling and silking, because what boron's doing, it's mobilizing the sugars and it's feeding the kernels that were just fertilized from that tassel phase. So that's more of an agronomic approach to placing boron in your program.
I asked you guys to remember that $4.20 package. There is biological. Say the biologicals don't work, we know that there's something on there. But we also have to look at the field and say, okay, where is it most likely to happen? So in this particular field, 60% of that soil is above a 3.5% organic. What do we expect upon higher soil? There's more biological activity. That helps have better water movement, soil solution, up, down, sideways. We have better soil structure. Now we've got 40% of that field that is lighter soil, lighter, weathered, likely eroded ground. So what we kind of looking at is, where would I expect a biological approach in a field like this? I would expect to see it logically makes sense on ground that's a little tougher. Ground's tighter, less water movement. So what I'm asking now in this particular field is, $4.26 an acre that we biological micro package. I got 40% of that field that's got to subsidize the rest of it. So I didn't run the numbers, but less than half of the field I would expect to see it. I think that's why it's important that when we sit down and go to the ground that you guys can look at it, want to utilize the product. Let's make sure it fits. Now, there's fields out there that are 90% pocket down of higher organic matter, more biological activity. That may be a much better fit to put in some of these products, like a biological. That's where I would expect to see a return. So let's pick those fields, put it in there, But as far as the nutrient load and biological activity in a field like this, you kind of question: is there enough? Are we going to get a yield increase on that lighter ground to justify $4 a bushel of corn on that? But I'm not saying it won't. I'm saying you have a less of a chance, because on 40%, now I've got to get 2.5 bushel on that lighter ground, and I don't expect to see it. So now I have to get 2.5% on that 40%, or 2.5 bushel on that 40% of the field just to break even. I'm saying don't use it. I just think what we need to do is take an agronomic approach, hear that from farmers. That's why I think that on questions like this, and say, should I use it, should I not, it requires you to sit down for especially on a year where we're all kind of watched out. Now this is on the also on conditions. And again, that's why we got to sit down and look at together and say, this is payback. We look at boron, soil conditions where we pretty much would expect to see a deficiency, and they really eroded soils, low organic matter, just light ground that's in droughty conditions. Back to that product or that nutrient mobile. Copper, a lot of packing with copper in there. You have higher organic matter ground that is very acidic or very sandy. You could expect to see a moderate response to something like copper. Iron, calcareous soils, with a real high pH. Not being that I don't have that. Yes, we have high. Place to do it. Manganese, We have, when we have, soils or muck soils, see a lot of it. A little bit higher on that, but we also see it. Or we also see it when we have high pH. Turn around and we go back to my other deal. We end up with a real high pH, 73. You're gonna have to apply. The zinc got real low organic matter, or we got real high pHs. They get a response on, or we do get a good response on it. And with if we got real low pHs, they get a response on it. Got a low pH of 5.5. So again, like I said earlier, this variable to consider. Look at soils, look at cultural practices. We got to have these focus. But we consider part, build a package.
So now we're going to switch to soybeans, talking about it. So like the corn, we're going to go through, basically you need to go through the same exercise that we went through with the corn with soybeans. So this chart here is for 70 bushel beans. It's your nutrient removals and your soil and plant mobility. Same sort of, I'm not going to go through it in detail like I did for the corn, but same sort of key points. We should not be putting an emphasis on these micros for making sure our macros are taken care of. That's not what they're for. Same thing with secondaries. These should be built out in a program as well. What we want to focus on are these micros here at the bottom of the chart here. So that's all I have to say with that. So our next product here is for soybeans. It's a liquid product. They're saying it's a foliar application. It's an NPK with micronutrients. They're saying it's bio-powered with seaweed extract and amino acids. And they recommend applying it at crop establishment, vegetative stages, and pod fill. So here again, we're in this really big window, which we just talked about when we were talking about corn. You need to dose these micronutrients at the right time. So buyer beware when you see this on a label. Get with an agronomist or do your research and make sure, okay, if we're going to be putting on one of these micros, we need to be putting it on at the right time. And then we look at this. We got NP and K. Like I just said, what are they really doing in this package? I mean, they really don't need to be there. They're not. These should be taken care of. Well, with beans, we're not really looking at nitrogen, but P and K, this should all be taken care of with the fertility program that's soil applied, your soil testing, a more macro approach for those. So same exercise for this micro for the soybeans. You start with your product density of 9.9, and then you look at your product rec rate of 1 quart. You multiply the two, you get 2.5 pounds per acre. And then in the next step, you go down and you calculate your pounds of nutrient applied per acre. So you go across through there for zinc. The label says you have 0.5% of zinc in that product. You multiply it by your pounds of product per acre, you're getting 0.012 pounds of nutrient applied per acre. Same mental exercise that you need to take with, like we did with the corn. What are we getting out of this? Are the micronutrient removals met? Well, in this case, they're not. So for 70 bushel beans, as you saw on the chart there a couple slides ago, for zinc, you need 0.161. And, this micro pack at a quart, we're getting 7.7% of the removal satisfied. So it's just you need to do this exercise to really see and pinpoint, what are we getting out of it? Do we need it? And basically justify the economics of $32 a gallon or $8 an acre.
On this one here, we kind of broke that down. Price, buying those components individually. Apply on the effectiveness or sensitivity of the crop, some of these microbes. But break it all down, got 88 cents. It's not, not saying that we can't possibly do it. I'm not saying that this don't work. I just think without field in, field out. Our consistency is very, very questionable. So when we break that all down, I went down and data that. Macros, apply a late digital, sorry, but they change the color, but it doesn't really add. So then we kind of throw everything onto the crop. When does it need it? And our field conditions. And it doesn't dictate them. That's why working one field didn't true. Next field probably didn't do anything. Maybe another field that actually lost. But I'm stressing the importance of sitting down and pulling that apart on acres. Fields and say, does this make sense to apply? But if we break that down, we got $7.12 difference. We broke them down and the package. I just think it's a little price to pay for.
So now looking at more of a sound agronomic approach, the theme just keeps going on and on here with these micros. We need to pay attention to these uptake curves when it comes to micros. Like I said earlier, this particular product we were just talking about, they claim wide application windows. You can put it on whenever you want, but these removal or these uptake curves say otherwise, and you need to be aware of that and pay attention to it. We're doing it so we have uptake efficiency and a yield increase. That's the goal. And in this particular case with soybeans, most of these, as you can see, these uptake curves, they really take off. They're in the late vegetative and early reproductive stages of the plant. So, depending on the product, we could say an R3 fungicide application is a good fit.
This kind of goes back, and very similar to what we have in beans, is look at the soil conditions, look at the field conditions. Are we going to get a response out? So when we look at boron, we know what the field conditions, the soil conditions are. Then we look at the sensitivity. All right, how sensitive is that crop to boron deficiencies with those type of conditions? Moderate. Okay. Have guys are playing it in very sandy field or just really tough piece of ground, there could be consequence of boron application. Most of our soils don't fall into that category. So you kind of question, I want to go out. Am I going copper? I wouldn't put copper. Don't have conditions for really disposal type soils. Don't deal with it massive. Then you turn to look and say, all right, really don't need that one. Why am I buying? Iron, live in Ohio. Live in full manganese, probably see more of that when we want to add soil or much type soil, very high organic matter, or we have really high pH on here. So we know that the crop is very susceptible, has high sensitivity to that. So out of this entire package, if I was to say, okay, what micronutrient is most important? Probably manganese. And then zinc, if we have those conditions, if we go back to what's the crop sensitivity in that condition, relatively low. Again, you got a 5.5 pH out there. Fine, and don't worry about it. But I guess the whole point of this type of slide here is sit down with people. Payback, this one. So going back to, but pH is important. This way, to eliminate a lot of those micro issues facing corn or beans. Then we identify what's our target. Know that corn responds to zinc. Know that there's a lot of where manganese beans. Let's identify that by looking at the whole field package and say, what is the most probable thing that we have after we met our macros and our secondary? So now we're looking at micros. What's the most one? What is the most likely to give us a return? Then we want to make sure that those rates are sufficient to do what we're asking them to do. So we go back to the one package and we had like, I'm not sure if that's enough to do it. Yes, the crop is pulling some out of the soil, but I'm not sure if I want to hang my hat on 1.8% of the crop on that. Do it. And us, the acres, come up with a fairly solid indicating opinion on whether payback on that microphone. That's our contact. So, any questions, or should I think we're probably tight on time? Got questions?
Very well. Oh, I got the type of look on. I do now. Okay, Nobody's gonna argue if we go to lunch sooner. We're not. Already said. I just think we have to-
Talk about some of the pieces that we're dealing with in corn. Uh, We've got just ways, different management approaches to manage some of the issues. I know that we've got a build up of first spot. It's at builds each year. Last year, been a little bit earlier, but we just wanted to touch base on that. Different ways to get to apply. And just things to consider when looking at a crop and saying, what's the best way to lower the risk of this? So familiar with the disease triangle. You've got to have the environment, the pathogen, and the host. That's what we've got all three of them. But how that environment comes in, we're planting corn, so we're going to have, we got the host. We know the pathogen present, because we've all seen forest spot the last couple of years. So now, do we have the conditions that are going to be creating a problem? So the three of them, this is just my take on it, but the primary concern in this area that we're all in, gray leaf spot, had to deal with that for years, northern leaf blight, and then tar spot kind of creeping in and causing issues the past couple of years. So when we looked at the different conditions, and it goes back to like I said, we have the host, we got the pathogen, they're all around. Now we look at the environmental conditions for it. So for northern corn leaf blight, moderate temperatures, good conditions, wet leaf surface, any higher nitrogen levels in the soil, no-till, or reduced tillage, heavy dew, affect the crop at not any time, and add it with hybrid selection to a certain extent. We look at tar spot, cool temperatures. Northern corn's moderate, tar spot's cool, approximately the same temperature range, humid conditions, prolonged leaf wetness, minimal till. Again, corn's susceptible to it. And there are some hybrids out there that have a greater degree of tolerance to it, but by and large, at least 30 bushel or really ways to do. So one may respond a little better to it, but still pay the yield loss if we have a heavy intensity. Then we look at gray leaf spot. We've been dealing with that for years, but it's warm temperatures. Again, humid conditions, leaf wetness, minimal till, right on down the line. So what's the conditions for decent corn growth? Lots of moisture, have very temperature change. We can have up to 85 degrees during the day, 5 at night. Well, there's windows for all of that. Heat's coming in. So whatever we have conditions for corn growth, yields at the end. Are also conditions for one of these. We're going to get caught with something generally. If you have a drought or everybody's corn burns up, well, we got it. So then we kind of look at the, okay, what's the options that we have to deal with to help mitigate some of this disease pressure? So at planting, seed treatment, pre-seed. Every company offers very good seed treatment. Some of them are just a little higher level package, you pay a little extra for it, but they're pretty good. I mean, great insect control, some fungal pathogens, environmental conditions, when we go and put that into the ground, it may exceed their suppression capacity. And just the example is crown pine. You know, we've got Fusarium, Butadiene, Arachnoides, Bithium, Rhizoctonium. It's a complex. Nobody really knows the module. So specifically, that's what it is, but it creates crown pine and possible scar infection. But then, while it may work on some fields, if you have a problem in the past, you may want to go, okay, I'm not going to rely strictly on. Then we look at a fungicide applied with a starter fertilizer. Highway and pretty effective, had shown very positive results for the past few years, and it kind of another layer of suppression on some of the ground stock crops. Label-wise, full gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, and it's got a supplemental label, tar spot suppression. It also says in the different, but in the label, it says that they come in on a late fungicide application, depending on seed pressure. So I don't think a guy should go, okay, I'm going to put down Xyway and I don't have to think like colors or whatever it is, starter. I can walk away, come back and look at the corn, September, telling it, it's quite good. So another option, so I'm not going to deal with fungicide, I don't like the price or whatever the issue. Don't want to look at that. You can come in on a P8, P7, P9, P8, P10, apply a fungicide on there. It does give good control on grazing spot of those three that we're targeting, and it can mitigate some of that crop stress. That maybe hot temperature, little drier conditions allows the plant to go ahead and weather that stress a little bit. I would look at this if we skip fungicide at plant. Don't want to deal with it. This is a good option to come in, make an application. One thing I kind of italicized this next line there, but when we look at last year, when we had tar spot, it came in about the first half of July, it started popping up all over. We look at our early planted corn, everything that was put in the ground in late April, therefore we saw a lot of tar spot issues. Then we turned around and looked at the corn later on, that was planted later on, corn at the end of May, that disease pressure was much less than that July timeframe. So it leads me to believe that we all remember the 2.5 weeks of everybody staring at the shop walls, waiting on the ground to dry out, part of May, and then 2.5 weeks of May, cool, wet, corn in the ground. I'm firmly convinced that that's when it was infected with tar spot. So we had to do, if we would have came in our P8 application, probably would have cleaned that up. What's an advantage is you can use your existing sprayer. It gives you an opportunity to throw in another micronutrient. A pitch for, I like boron on corn. Go back to that slide or the previous presentation where we're talking about when to apply that, when that uptake curve was coming. It gives a good opportunity for that. We can also use a lower, quote unquote, generic product, something that's not going to cost us $15 an acre or more. Let's look at something a little less, and cost-wise, it will allow us to go ahead and push, have conditions conducive for a higher infestation for seed pressure. We can come back in at a later time, an R2, R3 application on for the longer residual product. think it's cheap enough. I wouldn't go the lower rates the way they promote it. Throw in half rate of the boron, 10% product, 15 gallons of water going there. But then take either one of those applications, nothing at planting and nothing at P8. That BTR1 application window probably the best option. Going in there, we can add in a boron, or you can add in a micro if you feel that that's going to get it. More feedback on that. Sometimes we end up with some set pressure, flipping silk, whatnot. They're not blanket applying insecticides, only you don't need them. Nothing on the drill it or anything. I just don't like to kill off everything. And but that application at that BTR1 is a little bit early for that season-long control, residual control, that plant health. But then I should have broke this slide up a little, but go back to our at planting application of say that Xyway product, or we come back in with the generic FP8, then now we can look at an R1 to R3. I know it's R2.5 is not a growth stage that I come up with, but if we come in late, if that plant protected pretty well, and we've got great leaf spot, or we've got northern, or we've got tar spot pressure, or conditions are dictating that it's going to have pressure, we can come in and make that application as late as possible, pick up, knock off the seed, that residual there, and keep that plant green. So when we look at grain fill, I want that corn plant, I don't want to turn in premature death on it, because we're going to start losing grain fill weight. But there's a lot that goes on late in the season. That plant is possible. That's why we want to shove that fungicide application as late as possible. And that is just kind of again, I just kind of screenshotted that in there. You know, the water. And there's a lot of really good products in that range. So that's a lower end rate of it. Got boron in with that. It's got a fact that that's an aerial application. Nobody really wants to drive through the corn like that.
Okay, I get to talk about the stuff that nobody wants to talk about. So as Jim's talked about, tar spot is really, so the question is do we need to make a second application? Do we need to be in something in that R2 to R5 range to get complete tar spot control? And this is a tough one because it costs a lot of money. And we can't just build this program out and say, yep, just do it no matter what. But there's a couple things we have to think about here. And first of all, if we're doing a fungicide application at BTR1, that gives us about 14 to 21 days of protection. We have about 42 days of grain fill. And if we don't protect that plant all the way through, over half of the dry matter gets added from R3 to R5. And that's a real problem because of tar spot. With gray leaf spot and northern leaf blight, we've got some genetic resistance built into most of the varieties you're planting. And if we make that one fungicide application, we can usually get by without having to do it again. Sometimes, but not always, tar spot may come in later. And if we have, as Jim said, the disease triangle, if we have the right environmental conditions, because we know the inoculum's there. I mean, every single field, particularly as we are from basically Columbus west, we've all seen a lot of tar spot there. As we go east, maybe not quite as much, but I'm going to say pretty much in our whole trade area, all the way to New York, that we have that inoculum for tar spot there. So then it becomes a question of, do we have the right environmental conditions? And today, nobody can answer that question. But what I think my goal here is for you guys to think about what you're protecting and what you're not protecting. Now, a good approach is what Jim was talking about, is if we can delay that application to like R2, got a pretty good chance of making one application and covering ourselves on tar spot and being done. But if you're doing like a Xyway program and nothing else, and you come in at VT at Tassel for your gray leaf spot in northern and trying to get that chunk of tar spot, you're exposing yourself to the second half of the grain fill period. You're putting at risk the 55% of that dry matter grain fill that's going to be there. And I don't have a take-home message, do this, this, and this. My message to you guys is think about this as a system and think about what's your disease plan. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So you can, first of all, you can have a plan, because you're not going to call up your drone pilot or your airplane or your ground rig guy and say, I want you to spray my corn at R2 today, because it's going to go from R2 to R4 really fast and you're going to miss the window. So the plan needs to be today what you're going to do if tar spot comes in. So from an economic standpoint, this is where it gets really, really dicey. The products that do the best on tar spot are your most expensive products. They're going to be your $20 plus per acre products. And there really is no shortcut around that. We've had some guys like thinking about using Quilt XL. Quilt XL has some activity on tar spot, but it's really not that good a product for that particular disease. You're going to need to look at Aveltima, Delaro, Mirabis Neo, and there's some others I didn't put on the list. I just listed the ones that are most popular. Like I said, that cost is going to be $21 to $23 an acre. So before you spend that money, you really want to make sure you're going to get a return on investment. You're also going to have about $14 to $17 an application, because you're having to get it air applied, most likely, ground applied maybe, but no matter what, it's going to cost you about $14 to $17 an acre. You put that together, that's $37 an acre. And that's a big number when corn's $4.50 a bushel. You need about 8 bushels. That number should be burnt into your head. You need about 8 bushels to break even on this deal. And that's a pretty big number to get. Except if we have severe tar spot, it can be 30 to 50 bushels per acre. I'm not trying to scare you into this, but I think you have to also realize you cannot bury your head in the sand and say, I'm done spending money, because that last $30 may be the $100 that you get back on it. Once again, if corn's $6 or $7, well, I'd really wish that would happen. That would make this so much more fun to talk about. But it's probably not. Who knows? And with all this, scout. With the integrated ag, you need to partner and don't get sucked into 300 bushel corn. I'm just going to spray it, because there's just not very much money in this. But if we scout, and we pragmatically approach this, I think we can decide whether we need to pull the trigger or not. And if we do, we should feel pretty good that you will see 10 to 12 bushels of yield response in those worst case scenarios. So have a plan and try to build that plan such that you've got flexibility. The idea of making that first application someplace in that R1 time frame can go a long ways towards not having to do it again. And be prepared. I think that's all I've got here, Jim. Okay, I guess I got one more slide. When to pull the trigger. So this is a map. These are all the counties, United States, that have had tar spot in them, and we're slowly but surely seeing this all creep across the United States. And it's kind of a cool season disease, like Jim said. So it seems to be more of a problem to the north and to the south, but we're basically marching across pretty much all the corn producing states, major corn producing counties in Ohio at this point. So I think both Jim and I are of the opinion that it's here. It's not a matter of, well, I don't have it yet. It's here. The inoculum is around. So what should be your target areas? Once again, if you've got gray leaf spot in northern, it makes it a little easier because you're probably going to apply a product that's going to give you some tar spot activity. So that makes it a little easier. You're going after more than one disease. Got high yield potential. That probably means you've got really good growing conditions, which probably means you've got really great disease environment. So if you're sitting there in July and you're going, this corn could be 240 plus, you probably ought to be thinking about what your disease approach is going to be on that late season. For tar spot, it's moderating temperatures. It's 2023 where we had a lot of cloudy, smoky, cooler conditions. That's really gonna build itself towards when we can see more tar spot. And if grain prices go up, cross our fingers, makes this decision a little easier. If you've not made any application and you're into R2, you really need to pay close attention and really be scouting your fields, because you really have got nothing set up at that point to help you out. And I think that's my last slide.
Alrighty, somehow we managed to finish early, so that's a good thing. So we'll go ahead and do Q&A before lunch. Here we got about 15 minutes. So first question is, what is your source of crop removal rates of micronutrients? Trying to remember which table we looked at. Put it together a while back. It's either crop protection network or it's lowest years. Probably produced. There's where we kind of pulled that out. I put it together a while ago. All right, next question is, what is the answer to correcting nutrient stratification? I've got my opinion.
Moldboard plow, there you go. They're really, there are some pretty hardcore no-tillers that are going into doing some sort of deep tillage practice every so many years, just to kind of break things up and try and mix that profile up a little bit. I don't doubt is anybody here still got a moldboard plow that works? In the shit. So that's probably not an answer. I don't know. You got an answer, Evan?
Not a very good one. Mary Palmer did some research on this. I can't remember what the results were in that, but at the end of the day, it really impacted yield that much.
That would be I think there's bigger fish to fry than that. You can solve the stratification problem and create a plow pan problem or an erosion problem. I personally don't worry about stratification much.
Next question is, the formula for potassium crop removal as good at the high yields, like some fields had in 21 and 23, as it is with normal?
So that equation gets broken into two parts. Part one is we're trying to identify where we've got high, medium, and low potassium levels, and that's what that index is for. The second part is we use crop removal. Most of the time we use crop removal from your yield data to replace what was taken off. So that is the removal piece. So the equation works fine for what it's doing, and we're just allowing the yield data to drive the crop removal, or we'll use a yield goal to drive that.
Care to share any thoughts on precision planting, ground for agronomics at home soil testing labs? Yeah, I know at Commodity Classic they had this out there last weekend, and I heard about it about a year ago as well. Mobile testing labs, or I don't know if you call them necessarily mobile testing. Soil testing equipment is kind of complex, and ICP machines. I'm sure it's accurate, but at the end of the day, it comes down to still got to have the density of still collecting samples. So putting it into this mobile soil testing. If you guys aren't familiar with it, it's kind of hard to explain. You probably have to look it up, but essentially you pull your own soil samples and put them into this mobile lab, and it will spit out soil test results. But it still comes back down to can't get around that. High density. Next question: doesn't Skyway kill all the good soil microbes? No. All right. That's thoughts on N-furrow starter programs? What should we be targeting to accomplish? On N-furrow, kind of look, both sides will kind of match the 5 gallon. 5 gallon is kind of a sweet number because we have enough flow to make sure that we have even distribution across the different units. And so there's some really good products out there, 618.6, 624.4, that type of thing. That's good and clean. I like 1034.0 at 2.5 gallon because it gives us about 10 units of phosphorus, and you can add a quarter zinc. The problem with 1034.0 is kind of a vocabulary when we get a little bit of salts and stuff in there, like screens, and then you're sitting there with, especially whoever told you to 1034.0. But there's some good, we don't, potassium doesn't affect that much for that. So we look at phosphorus and zinc. Like I say, 2.5 gallon of 1034.0, or say 3 gallon of a good plain rural blend on a retailer's offer. It's a little pricier, but it doesn't have any problems with it. Put your zinc in with it, and it gives you room to go ahead and put a biological if the field actually feel that you will get a return on it. It goes back to that organic matter distribution, biological activity, looking at the field, all that. Am I going to get paid out $15 input? But I think that laying that down there, you can't go too high of a rate of any nutrient, but that 5 gallon tank. All right, next question. Should Tri-States expand the maintenance range for potassium by 12% to account for temporal instability? Not sure where you got the 12% from, but
That's what I talked about.
Okay, sorry.
They were listening. You weren't.
I guess I'll get some input on this and then pass it over to Dave, but we're part of 4Rs. We're very involved with that program, and not that they have necessarily direct impact on grading the Tri-States, but I can tell you that their parameters for accepting or not accepting soil test critical levels are looked at very closely, and they're going to probably be changing. They're a little bit lenient on passing in general. And
further on the temporal part.
Yeah, so if you do that, 1,000 acres, 12% more fertilizer on 1,000 acres. We only need fertilizer on 10% of those acres. So purely from an economic standpoint, it doesn't make any sense to do that. The other part is we also have to think about it from an environmental perspective. And from an environmental perspective, we're over applying on, say, 80% to solve this problem. And that doesn't make any sense. So what makes sense, at least to me, is let's do a really good job of identifying where we have potassium issues and solve it that way. And we can do it by simply going into a shorter interval of 2 years. Yes, I got that. I'll let you handle the one down there. If we soil sampled in dry fall 24 and potassium levels came back lower than expected, what should we do? So that it kind of, like my answer always is, it depends. If it's really, really like bizarrely off, then we probably should resample it and see what's going on. Typically, that's not what happens, but if that's the case, that's the case. It just builds my case again for what I would really suggest is that you get into a 2-year cycle, and now you're going to use that rolling average, and you're going to pull that through. I mean, the answer may be correct. They may be low. I mean, there's a 60 to 70% chance that's what's going on. Yes, I got one other one there. What is the optimal density to create an accurate K index? So that comes back to the spatial integrity, and it's no different than what it's been before, and that is as much as you can afford. I think if you're in a 2-year sampling cycle, work with your advisor. There's some other things that go into this from an economic standpoint purely, like is it a ground that may be short-term rental and you're not sure what's going to happen down the road? Maybe it's a ground that you're just know it's going to go away. That could influence the density. What you're trying to do, as far as if you're trying to build out seeding racks and some where you really need a high resolution, can make a difference. But in general, the general answer is someplace between, I think, doing half acre over half acre would be the most, and then the least would be 2 acre over 2 acre would be the range. And talk with your advisor and figure out what works best for you. You get to talk about RFK.
In a wide drop side dress program, what would you recommend to use on a high yield potential corn farm? Then there's a highway with side dress or fungicide at PA, 4x fungicide. In a wide drop, side dressing coming back, someone who needs to have what you put down there. But you're looking at coming across 5B6, got a sufficient amount of nitrogen put down with starter program, got your sulfur in it. So when we get up to that B5, B6, push off because of weather till B7, B8, heaven forbid, but it's happened. I don't know if I would want to wait till B5 to start side dressing just because trial. But you know, you come back and as long as your total nitrogen, total applied nitrogen and your sulfur is up there in that 20 unit range, of the combination part of the other. I guess that's honestly the question I get. And then is Dyway with side dress or fungicide at P8 followed by the R2 lab. I was planting corn in April. I would probably think that what I've seen is the Dyway application with the starter is pretty effective. Not in furrow, but a 2x2 placement. So forth. then follow back on an R2, R3 application, R2.5. There's a trade-off. I waste considerably more money than the fungicide probably, or at least one that I would recommend at that V8 application. So you got $20 versus $6. Kind of lose your ability to throw in a boron application. So there's trade-offs. It's really how much risk do you want to take and how does it fit into your management plan? So I guess honestly, I've effectively answered that question. Kind of like Dave. And then zinc in furrow at planting and boron foliar on R1. Yes.
All right, got time for a couple more here. Do you recommend getting involved with NRCS for an IBM plan? Yeah, I mean, I think it probably depends on who your local NRCS guy is. There's some that are better than others. Selfishly, I would say work with crop consultant like Integrated Ag. So there's a lot, going on with these equip CSP programs to where 80% of the information is what we do. So I think we have a good fit for those programs. Definitely not the experts on all the background that goes into those programs, but from an agronomic data, definitely have that. So for soybean spoiler, should I try boron, manganese, or molly? Wow, that's a good question.
I think what probably your biggest payback of the things that are up there, again, it depends on field conditions. What type of soils are you dealing with? But I would expect manganese to, just looking at a line there, I would expect to see your breeding concern from manganese.
That's for last year. This one is a little bit dangerous. A little off topic, but if RFK limits the sources of pesticides, what will our next best option? Yeah, I mean, the future of ag is, I think, I don't know what exactly it looks like, but there's technology, robotic weeding, a smaller equipment in the field, the mechanical weeding, all sorts of things. I don't know what's going to happen. I like to think that current administration is going to certainly support the farmer and that the farmer's not going to get hurt. And hopefully our new Secretary of Ag has a equation our current administration and they don't do anything crazy. Do you think micros can get into plant through the leaves, or does it need to go through roots?
So, macros, not really. Okay, doesn't really get through the leaf that much. Secondaries to a lesser extent, they don't really get through there. But when we look at micros, it does pull it up to the left. Because we've got it in the soil, it does pull it up as the plant needs it, but they also, micros can get into it. It's nowhere deficient. Look at manganese application. Well, we've got high organic matter ground, these are chlorotic. What are we doing? 70, 18, almost R1. Go in there, we apply manganese. We've all seen it. Turns around, changes the color, allows that photosynthesis to take place, to get back, mitigate that chlorosis tissue, and where we don't spray it, we've got 20 bushel less beans. So looking at a 6-7%, that's probably got 6 or something. Therefore, we see our timeline. All of us see it, so it's yes, I go to the also to the one.
We're closing down questions. I don't know.
I better hang out.
My answer is no.
I don't know what amine nitrogen is.
I want
Neat.
to thank everybody for coming to this year's agronomy meeting. All this meeting is very informative, provide agronomic information, not salesy. Hopefully you guys took away 1, 2, 3 nuggets to take home with you. Hope everybody has a successful 2025 crop year. Anything you guys, please reach out to us. Website or else. Find one of our crop consultants. Love to work with you. With that, do you have any special instructions? Yes, we're just gonna put up a thank you slide. It should have, I think, a barcode, yay, credits for me. Also a sign in there at the front as well. So, Michaela said that we're gonna release tables for the lunch line. So, thank you again.
Oh, great. How you doing? Thank you. It's a complicated one, but I don't know about that. It is interesting that I don't know if you've seen it or not, but how it's just so much more prevalent today than it was, I want to say 10 years ago, but
Yeah, agreed.
yeah, John. Yeah, you can use it.